Many people struggle with math. This is because it's taught incorrectly. It's not so much a subject, as much as it a language. Math is the universal language. To properly learn a language, requires different methods of study and practice, than other subjects. Some things could easily be learned simply by reading about them. Few people ever actually learn a language well, if learned in the same way as traditional subjects. Memorizing words does little to truly learn a language. The single best way to learn a language is by speaking it. It's really not that complex. In America, high schools/colleges have actual language requirements. It's silly. Taking a couple semesters of some language and memorizing words won't help to actually know it. Contrast this to somebody who physically goes to that country and surrounds themselves with people who speak it. They'll learn more in the next month than in 5 years of memorizing words. They learn by doing. By practicing. I believe many Americans, I can only talk for my country, struggle with math, is because of how brutally ineffective the methods in which we teach it are. It should not be viewed as another subject. It's a language. Much like memorizing words for a diff language doesn't do much, memorizing formulas is silly. The emphasis should be on speaking it in the form of practice. And more practice. And more practice. Unlike any other subject, aside from computer science, which is really just a lot of math at its roots though, you cannot become good at it without practice. It's a discipline. For many subjects people can quite easily cram several chapters of material in a short amount of time to catch up. With math, if you don't do problems daily and practice repeatedly, you cannot just skim a textbook and know it. There are no shortcuts. The more you practice, the better you get. And those underlying fundamentals need to be emphasized from the beginning. Having to memorize anything defeats the purpose, yet countless teachers make students memorize. When you try writing in a language, nobody prevents you from using a dictionary. If anything, it's encouraged. Who wouldn't want to improve their vocabulary? The skill isn't memorizing the words, it's knowing when to use them. Through practice, or speaking/reading/writing, these new words now feel natural, and are added to your knowledge of the language. People that memorize vocab often can't use those words in conversation. Apply this to math. Don't memorize the formula. Learn when to use it. How to use it? Practice. It's a language, not a subject. It's not difficult, we just teach it terribly, and students learn it ineffectively. Edit. I'd also like to add another key piece that I left out of the post initially, that much like a language, there are many ways to communicate a message. When writing, or speaking, there's more than one way to get across your message. Many ways of phrasing something. Apply this to math. The following is actually a major problem *. I remember trying to help family members/or kids I tutored with their math HW. I'd try to sit with them and explain an approach. Sometimes it didn't really click, so I'd try a different approach. Eventually we'd land on one that worked. But the issue, and boy is this a big one, I'd hear a response along the lines, "The way you showed me makes so much sense, but I'm not allowed to use that method for my HW. Or I'm not allowed to do in my test. That's not how the teacher taught me," and this is just brutal. It defeats the purpose. Students should be able to learn the why in any form that takes. Not be held hostage to a single method. Teachers that do this, it's one of the best ways to quickly shatter a kid's confidence, or poorly teach them about math as a whole. People who have taken higher level math know there is often many ways to arrive at an answer. Something can be proved through different means, there isn't always strictly one approach. Similar to a language, there is more than one way to arrive at an answer, more than one way to do something. I take major issue with teachers that will teach the method they learned, but nothing more, and then require their students to use that method. Not everybody learns the same way, and that's such a huge element to realize. Some students grasp concepts quicker, some slower. I've tutored many students, and they all learn differently. Some understand through visualizing, like drawing a picture. As the level of math increases, the type of visual can take different forms, but the idea remains the same. Other students learn better with other means. The end goal is to understand though. Why it's important, what the actual goal is, what's being asked. I often like to tell kids I tutor, to try to explain it back to me. If there's a problem, I want them to literally walk me through it step by step. Don't skip a step. They can look at a formula sheet, and say at this step I will apply this formula. And erase y. But ultimately it requires practice and true understanding. How to arrive at that understanding can take many shapes. I agree I struggled with math until I got to high school and one teacher finally taught me correctly. I'm an engineer now. I agree. A teacher once called me out in the class and embarrassed me in front of all my classmates when I failed on a paper. And this was when I was a 9-year-old kid. Instead of giving me the right push to improve, it made me hate math entirely. Literally gave up on understanding it. I really wish I had a teacher in school who understood my struggle instead of making me feel terrified to ask them doubts because I didn't want to look dumb in front of everyone again. I agree, but not completely. I also used to think that math was a language, poorly taught in any school, but now I think that it's a way of thinking that is deeper than a language. And there are shortcuts. I know that your mother tongue shapes a lot of your perceptions. There are cultural things that stick with the language you're speaking and that explain how a whole culture developed. Math, on the other hand, develops a certain way of thinking. That's the thing, math shows you a way of thinking, and if you can jump on it, you can understand math and how it develops. So yes, it uses a certain language, but the main thing, it shows how to think. The other side of the coin is someone has to be willing to learn. I tutor math. You wouldn't, or maybe you would, believe the amount of kids who simply don't want to try. They just say they aren't good at math, so will therefore put in zero effort. Hell, I've had students who were actually good at math pretty much decide on their own they don't give a fuck and just say they aren't good at math so they don't have to work at it. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. Homeschooling my stepson through Corona has been tough. Largely this has been because he has convinced himself that math is impossible. One thing that has helped is getting him math books from the grade before and going back to the basics. Since he didn't have a firm grasp of the basics, everything else was confusing and too big a leap. I helped him to understand that math is easier than reading, because in reading English one must memorize a bunch of rules and then memorize the millions of exceptions. You make a word plural by adding an s, except when you have to add an es, but not when it's geese or oxen or children, blah blah blah. Math rules are always the same and they always make sense. So if you can read, then you've already learned something harder than math. I learned I enjoyed math much later on in life when I was using it for reasons that weren't forced on me, such as how to maximize the efficiency of a factory to pump out the most items possible, or figuring out how many pennies could fit on the surface of the planet, rather than here's a problem we give you. Solve it. I'm pretty sure I have undiagnosed dyscalculia. I always struggled with it throughout school. Anything beyond very basic arithmetic was like a foreign language to me. I distinctly remember one teacher who was otherwise alright doing random pop quizzes of math problems. I'd naturally do awfully and pray that we had to mark our own answers instead of swapping with someone else. I somehow managed to scrape a passing grade at general level, Scottish standard grades. Nearly 10 years after having left school, I get by with personal finances and various other things, but it has always been my Achilles heel in an otherwise well-rounded education. Common core is child abuse. You lost me at math, my guy. I think this is why there is a lot of strife with parents about new math. I'm 20, but I have a brother that is 12 and sister who is 9 who have been using the new math. My parents loathe it, but from what I could see by glancing at their homework is that there is more emphasis on understanding math now, rather than just here's this method, do it like this or fail. For example, when my sister was learning subtraction, they first showed it on a number line so she could visually see what the process of subtraction is actually doing. I think it helps a lot, and that if this newer idea of understand math rather than just use this formula catches on, it will be a more enjoyable subject for everyone. So basically practice, don't just learn facts. If you're learning maths for an exam, some things should just be learned as facts, e.g. the values of cos. And to be honest, what you've said could just as easily be applied to half the subjects in a school. In fact, pretty much any subject that exams that have essay-style answering and exam technique matter could be. Also by your logic subjects such as music, history, and drama could all be seen more as a language than a subject. Love this. I also think that symbolic logic should be taught alongside / before algebra. I had bad math teachers right up until grade 12. I started to love math that year, but it was already too late to change my educational path. I really don't believe so. Math is a form of logic, and is therefore much less complex than language. People ought to be teaching how to understand math, not how to do math. Math builds on itself. If you don't understand and know how to add, subtract, divide, and multiply whole numbers, decimals and fractions, and also understand ratios and percentages, then you're simply not going to be prepared for algebra or geometry or anything higher. To put kids who haven't mastered those basics into algebra is doing them a disservice. I majored in math in college, and I'm shocked how many adults in the working world don't understand these basics. My wife is one of them, and she says that she just never understood those basics and therefore hated all subsequent math classes. Is real analysis, the more theoretical basis of calc, you could say, a language? No, it has a language, and you need to know how proofs are written in order to learn it, but it is stupid to say that it is a language by itself. Let's say you had learned French in order to write stories in French. Would you say that writing stories is a language? Yes, for physicists math can be a language. For engineers, biologists, chemists, programmers, all of the lame guys that don't learn real pure math, for them it might be a language. But math, in its core, is not about having a conversation. It is about making formal systems and researching problems and rules that arise. It is about finding the formal representation of an intuitive idea. Well, at least that is my impression, as I haven't learned a ton of pure math.